Hey there, this is going to be the video for those who will be leading, facilitating an off-campus small group that will be meeting after the message on Sunday, May the 17th. So that's you. You got the right video and in the right spot. Hey, let's do this. Let's go ahead. You should have received a email attachment with this email that gives you the link to this video. You should have received an attachment that gives you the Going Deeper discussion guide. So go ahead and get that print it out, get that in front of you, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through a little bit of this and maybe give you some things that can help you as you facilitate, prompt the discussion among your group. Now, let's up front that we've been going through this series called Aliens Among Us. We're out of 1 Peter, and today we're going to be, or this Sunday, we're going to be in 1 Peter 3 and looking at the first 8 verses of that chapter. And remember that 1 Peter is writing to a group of believers that are that they have meeting great resistance to their faith. It's kind of a hostile environment to their faith. There's some persecution going on. And so he's writing to them, talking to them about being holy, being set apart from something, but more importantly, being set apart to someone, to Jesus, and how that they live out their lives in light of this persecution in that type of environment, and how they respond to those around them is going to be a way to show the reality of who God is and the gospel. And so he's been dealing with that. We've been looking at that over the last several weeks. And this past week, we looked at how that we respond to those who are authority among us. Specifically, we looked at government and then in the slave-master relationship of that day, and then that translates into the places we find ourselves under authority today. And he points out that we are to be respectful. We are to respond with respect to those around us, even if they don't deserve to be respected, or even if we don't agree with them. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to go along with everything and that we have to fall in line with all things that are given there, but we do respond with respect. And that's the important thing of how we respond. Even when we disagree, how we respond will go a long way showing who God is, painting a picture of who God is, and also communicating the reality of the gospel. And in that context, flowing right out of that, and of course, the prime example of that was Jesus. And we looked at those verses, how Jesus responded when he was when he was suffering, and how did he respond? And what was his response? And so if we're going to be set apart to Jesus, if he is the master, the Lord of our lives, the ones that we're following, then we're going to fall in line with how he responded. Okay? And now that's the context of what we're going to jump into these verses. In these verses, we're going to be looking at how we respond to each other in the marriage relationship, as husband, as wife, as spouses, and how do we respond to each other. And again, the same thing's going to be true. Our responses are going to paint a picture of who God is and also become a way of proclaiming the reality of the gospel from a perspective of marriage. And it's either going to, and we're going to, how we respond to one another is going to communicate that there to the world around us, to the world in which we live, and those people that are around us. Now, in this, a couple of things let me just give you a couple of cultural context things to keep in mind. You'll hear this in the message as well. This obviously was written during a different time than we are in the 21st century. It's the first century. It's a patriotic. There was a very a male-dominated world at that time. And when Peter writes these words, he writes those in that understanding of those believers that are living in that kind of environment. And you'll notice as we go through this, he actually raises the value of women, and he affirms the value of women and affirms the care of women. And he does that also in the context of what we're talking about, in the sense of still how we respond, even in a situation that may not be good, how we respond, and especially in context of marriage, is going to show paint that picture of who God is and the reality of the gospel. Now, some of these people he's writing to, they're a place where the wives have come to faith and the husband hasn't. So he's writing to those believers. Women, the first 6 verses addresses those women who have come to faith and who are believers but are living with an unbelieving husband. And he writes to them about their responses is going to be a platform for communicating the gospel. And then he addresses the husbands in verse 7 and pointing out the fact that in the environment they find themselves in, even though it's a male-dominated world, and in many ways the males seem to have the upper hand in that century, he calls them and challenges them as husbands to respond to their wives in a way that's different. So in many ways, when we look through these verses, we're going to see an alien marriage, so to speak. a marriage that would be alien in the responses they have to each other, the people of that day. And we're going to find out too, it's the same thing of this day. There's a great pushback to some of this today because I think there's a misunderstanding of what Peter is saying here, but also because there's also has been a misunderstanding of marriage in general. All right, let me jump into the discussion guide with you. That's kind of a little bit of a background there to help you, maybe, hopefully help you anyway. Hey, we're going to start off as I always do, giving an opportunity to recap what you heard on Sunday. I hope this will be a great time of discussion for you. One reminder, don't feel like you've got to work your way through all of these 8 discussion points. If your group gets settled in on a spot and you spend time talking about that, so be it. And your time gets there, you as a facilitator leader, allow your group and encourage your group to explore that which is God is speaking to them about as a whole. Okay, so first one would be a recap. Hopefully you'll get some things. Always I encourage you, have a couple of things jotted down yourself to prompt that discussion. Number 2 is basically just a kind of a recap of what we've been talking about, an orientation statement leading into number 3, where we're going to look at Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to pull you out of 1 Peter for a minute. Go to Ephesians chapter 5, look at verse 21 through 33. In this passage here, Paul actually uses marriage to illustrate the relationship that Jesus has with his church. And oftentimes in the scripture, the church is referred to as the bride of Christ. Jesus is referred to as the bridegroom. And so Paul uses marriage to illustrate the relationship that Jesus has with the church, which tells us 2 things. Number 1, that marriage is a really big deal, that Paul would use that to illustrate the relationship. And then number 2 is we gain great insights into marriage from that illustration. And when you read through this, you're going to see, and as you kind of read through it, you're going to see some things that are brought out for the husband and the wife in this particular passage. And basically, when you boil it all down, it comes out to this. The husband is called to be a loving leader in the home. Leadership is not dictatorship. Get that clear right off the bat. Leadership, as I would define it, is one who inspires and influences others to go in a certain direction. And that's what a husband is to be. He's to be a loving leader in his home, set the pace for the home, and the pace in the way that's in God's direction and according to God's pace. And the wife in there is presented as being a respectful responder. She respects the position that the husband has in the home that God has given him, and she responds to that. In no way does that mean the wife is inferior. No way does that mean that she has no value, doesn't have anything to add, or anything like that. Obviously, it's just the opposite, because the wife is going to be one who respects and responds to her husband. In so doing, she's going to support, encourage, she's going to affirm, she's going to validate, she's going to help create an environment where her husband can carry out the responsibility that God has given him. And she does that not as one who is not equal with him. In other words, it's not that there's inequality in the marriage as far as the persons are concerned, but instead they are both have different roles and responsibilities. And as they carry those out in the way that God has set it up, then you have a beautiful illustration of Christ in the church, and a beautiful illustration. You'll have a beautiful marriage, and a marriage which proclaims the gospel there. Now, it says, what I asked, the discussion question there says, with this in mind, why does marriage have more potential to show the gospel than any other relationship? And here's the reason why. Because in marriage, you have 2 imperfect people who are placed in the closest relationship on earth, who begin to respond to each other in a way in which God has created that. And in so doing, people look at that and they see how that's working and see how that's taking place. And they realize that it's got to be something more than those people themselves. And they see that God is at work. Because in marriage, not only is it a beautiful way to proclaim the gospel, but as we know in marriage, when you put 2 imperfect people in the closest proximity of any relationship there is on earth, it also provides an opportunity for conflict to arise. And how you respond to that and work through that is going to proclaim the gospel to those around you. And that's why marriage makes more challenging. Even though there's great potential, it's more challenging because of what we just mentioned there. Number 4, go back to 1 Peter, looking at what we learned about marriage relationships there, and talking about this idea of being submissive. And real reasons I think it's hard for us to swallow that is because we've misunderstood what being submissive means. We oftentimes think of being submissive means that you're basically a doormat. You're quiet. There's no no input, there's no value or anything like that. It's totally opposite of what the Bible means by being submissive. Being submissive means simply that we recognize and respect and respond to that in that way, keeping in context of what we've talked about before. And we're going to deal with some of those things in the message about what submission is not as much as what it is. And so listen to that and listen for that, and that can help you, I think, in that discussion. But you're going to see that it's something that's hard for us to swallow. I emphasize the word us, not just wives, but husbands. All of us, it's hard for us to swallow this thing called submission, and we all submit in some way or other, in one way or other, to different areas and different ones in our life. And so use that, expand that, not just in this context of marriage, but in all of our relationships. And it says, prior to this past Sunday, what was your reaction to that phrase, submit yourselves? And you probably get some pretty good responses to that. I imagine some of them had some very strong feelings about that. And then ask, has that changed? Since you've listened to the message, has that changed? Has that changed your perspective of what that actual term means and how that gets carried out? Then in number 5, talks about where Peter encourages wives to cultivate their inner beauty. By the way, not that they neglect their external appearance. That's not what he's saying. But he focuses on one over the other. Why is that? Well, obviously the biggest thing is because inner beauty is going to go on for a lifetime. You all of us know we age and our external beauty changes, and there's changes that happen to us physically. But when that inner beauty is there, it is that which lasts for a lifetime. And that's why the emphasis is there in that way. Now, and gives you some opportunity to express some of the examples of how that can be expressed and how they've seen that expressed. I would encourage you to, how have you seen that expressed in other people? And I'll be honest with some of those beautiful people I know, beautiful women I know, are people that are maybe we'd say more older, advanced in years, and maybe their physical beauty has changed. Not that they're still not that they don't have a good external or beautiful external appearance. And I'm digging a hole here for myself, aren't I? Basically, what I'm saying is all of us change, and so our external appearances change. And maybe we don't look at 60 like we did at 20, obviously, but they're still beautiful because the beauty is seen for what God is doing inside and how that transformation of God working within us. And that inner beauty is the transformation of the Spirit of God. By the way, go look at Galatians 5:22 through 23. The fruit of the Spirit, that is the inner beauty that Peter is talking about there. Number 6 talks about the husband, moves to the husbands. How are husbands challenged to know their wives and being considerate of them, treating them with respect. And challenges, what we're looking at there is to get the men thinking about what does it look like to know your wife. In other words, what does it mean to be a student of your wife, to know your wife and to know her and know who she is and that's not know about her, but to know her in the sense of those things that move her, motivate her, to know her and who she is as a person, what it is that excites her, what it is that she's passionate about, what it is that in the sense of her feelings and things that she connects with. Really get to know her as a person and in that true sense of the word. And by the way, that brings me back to something about the inner beauty. I want to jump back to that in a minute. When we're talking about that, as you're looking, it talks about gentle and quiet spirit. Remember, we're talking not talking about a personality. Because there are different types of personalities. Some people are introverts, some people are extroverts, and so forth. The personality is not what he's talking about there. He's talking about the attitude and how that attitude that gets expressed. So keep that in mind. Now back to number 6 with the husbands. Get to know your wives. And I think, ladies, you might have to help on this some, because us guys sometimes just miss it. We just totally miss it because we're guys, okay? And so maybe this will be a great learning experience and opportunity for you in your small group in that, and getting some insights from the ladies in that way. And how does that tie into a wife being submissive? Obviously, when you're the kind of husband that's getting to know your wife, you are going to have a wife who's going to respond to your leadership, to the role God's put there in the home. By the way, one thing I did not mention earlier, but I want to make this very clear. When the Bible speaks about a wife being submissive to her husband. He is speaking about that as voluntary submission. It's never be forced. If it's forced, it's not biblical submission. Secondly, is a wife is to be submissive to her husband. It doesn't say to men, it says to her husband. It's in the marriage relationship that's to take place. So just get that clarity there as well. And then what I would encourage you to do is close out your time by discussing some of the gospel implications of the marriage model that Peter gives. In other words, how does, when this marriage model is working, when it's unfolding, how does that present the gospel to the people around us? Two things to just keep in mind. Number one, your marriage, our marriage, is a platform for proclaiming the gospel. Our marriage, your marriage, is a partnership for growing in grace. That is the marriage that is a gospel-centered, missional marriage that God has for us. Hey, have a great time today.
I've been restless on the inside, wondering about